The story begins with our protagonist, Peter, a psychologist in his mid-30s. He's haunted by nightmares and guilt over his daughter's tragic death, which he blames on himself. One night, he hears his wife, Carol, crying, as she's had a distressing dream. The next morning, Peter boards the bus and heads to work, where he tries to distract himself from his daughter's loss by listening to his patient's problems. His first patient of the day is Felix, an elderly man in his 70s, who seems stuck in the past. Peter asks Felix a simple question: who is the current president of the United States? At first, Felix finds the question ridiculous and answers Ronald Reagan. To confirm his suspicion, Peter asks Felix for the year, and Felix responds, 1987. Peter concludes that Felix is suffering from amnesia. Felix wonders if they've met before, and Peter confirms they did just last week. In the next scene, Peter chats with Duncan, who introduces him to various clients with diverse backgrounds, including Felix. We learn that Peter and Carol are still struggling to cope with the loss of their daughter, Evie, who passed away a year ago. Peter has painful flashbacks of his moments with Evie, ending with the tragic memory of finding her lifeless body in front of a truck. Duncan inquires about what diverted Peter's attention from Evie that fateful day, but all Peter recalls is briefly looking into a shop before the accident. Peter spends the next few days tending to his patients absent-mindedly, until he's snapped back to reality by one patient, Erica. She asks if she's boring him, and Peter reassures her that he's listening. Erica shares her feeling of invincibility. Later, Peter is startled by the sound of a passing train. As he's about to leave for home, he encounters a young girl holding a doll. He asks her who she's there to see, and she points to him. He inquires about her parents, but she remains silent. The girl gives him a small purse with her name, Elizabeth Valentine, on it. Peter asks if she can write, and suddenly the pencil starts shaking as another train goes by. The sound terrifies Elizabeth, prompting Peter to close the windows. But when he turns back, she's gone, having run out of the door. Outside, Peter discovers a message she wrote. 12787. That night at home, Peter visits the room where they keep Evie's belongings and gazes at her picture and keepsakes. The next day, as Peter leaves his office, he's shocked to find the same doll Elizabeth was holding. Opening his office, he sees her looking out the window. He asks what she sees, and she appears to choke, dropping to the floor. Panicked, Peter reaches for medication, but when he looks back, Elizabeth has vanished. The following day, Peter takes Elizabeth's doll to Duncan, who dismisses Peter's experiences as imagination. Duncan asks about Evie's age if she were alive, and questions Elizabeth Valentine's name. Remarkably, her initials, EV, match his daughter's name. Back in his office, Peter examines Elizabeth's case paper and the paper she wrote on. In a drawer, he finds the train pass she gave him. That night, Peter falls asleep on the train and is startled to see one of his earlier patients, Erica. Lights go out, and then something astonishing occurs. Peter gets off the train and witnesses Erica's eerie figure floating in the air. Peter's investigation takes a chilling turn when he discovers a death certificate for Elizabeth Valentine. What's even more unsettling is that most of the patients he's attended to in recent days, including Felix and Erica, are all deceased, and they all passed away on the same date, July 12, 1987, the same numbers Elizabeth had written on the paper. As a train rumbles by his window, Peter witnesses his former patients, now confirmed to be ghosts. Determined to uncover the truth, Peter turns to Duncan, recounting everything he's discovered and presenting the list of deceased patients. Peter expresses his belief that he might be hallucinating, but many aspects of the situation just don't make sense. When Duncan asks him to explain further, Peter suddenly realizes that Duncan is not actually present. He's been a figment of his imagination all along. Undeterred, Peter continues his investigation, searching for connections among his deceased patients. He identifies a common link: False Creek, the rail control station near his hometown. The next day, he boards a train and heads to his childhood home, where his father, William, lives. Peter arrives at his father's house and rings the doorbell. William, noticing something is amiss, questions Peter about his unexpected visit without his wife. In a light-hearted exchange, Peter jokingly suggests that his father should play the role of the shrink, but William reminds him that he's a retired cop. Exploring his old room, Peter retrieves a small box from the closet. Inside, he finds an old newspaper and stares at it intently. Afterward, he leaves the house and heads to a nearby bar, where he encounters an old friend named Barry. They engage in nostalgic conversation, and Barry sympathizes with Peter over the loss of his daughter. Peter shares that Evie's death has compelled him to revisit the events of 1987, but Barry resists, reminding him of their pact never to discuss those events. Peter opens up about the tragic deaths that occurred when they were just kids, prompting Barry to question why Peter is revisiting the past after so long. Suspicion grows that Peter intends to involve the police, but he tries to explain that he's been encountering ghosts. Barry becomes increasingly agitated and abruptly instructs him to stay away before leaving the bar. As Peter delves deeper into his past, his father, William, enters his room and notices the newspaper left on the bed by Peter. Unbeknownst to William, Peter embarks on a walk along the railroad tracks, where he experiences a vivid flashback of his teenage years. In this haunting recollection, he witnesses himself and his friend Barry, both at the age of 14, riding bicycles on the tracks. Barry shares that his older brother had informed him that this location was a popular makeout spot, and they hide behind a rock to spy on couples. Suddenly, they hear a woman's moan or scream. Their innocent teenage curiosity takes a terrifying turn as they realize they've left their bikes on the tracks, and a train is fast approaching. Desperate to retrieve their bikes, Peter attempts to reach them, but the train is too swift. Tragically, the train derails, resulting in a catastrophic crash that claims the lives of all the passengers. Young Peter approaches the wreckage and recognizes some of the passengers, including Felix and Erica, who were his recent patients. Shockingly, Elizabeth Valentine is also among the victims. The flashback concludes, and Peter resumes his walk. However, he's interrupted when he encounters Elizabeth Valentine. Suddenly, Felix appears behind him, his face bloodied, and he towers over Peter, allowing drops of blood to fall onto Peter's face. With this macabre encounter, Peter snaps back to reality. The following day, Barry is seen at the railway station, and Peter decides it's time to confess to the police. At the police station, Peter, although hesitant, fabricates a story, claiming that he was solely responsible for the incident. Barbara, a female cop, questions him about whether he ever discussed it with his father, who was a sergeant at the time. Peter denies any such conversation. Barbara, visibly upset, briefly excuses herself to collect her emotions, taking a moment to drink some water. During this time, Peter discovers the heartbreaking truth that Erica, one of his patients, was a victim of the train accident, and Barbara is her daughter. Ridden with guilt, Peter apologizes, and Barbara appreciates his honesty, assuring him that she will file an official report. She also shares that Peter's father had reached out to her immediately after the accident, offering kindness and support, which inspired her to become a cop. When Peter returns home, he hears a sound from his room and investigates. Inside, he begins to hear Elizabeth humming. Upon entering his closet, the door slams shut behind him, and he is subjected to eerie, croaking sounds. Suddenly, Elizabeth leaps at him, screaming in his face. Peter awakens to Duncan shining a flashlight in his face. Peter assures Duncan that he has revealed the truth and put it to rest, to which Duncan questions why they are still experiencing these phenomena. Duncan asserts that it's impossible for two small bikes to derail a train and suggests that Peter's mind is attempting to alter the reality because it's too unbearable. Duncan also reminds Peter that he doesn't even remember the exact circumstances of his daughter's death. With newfound determination, Barbara delves into the case files from the 1987 train wreck. Among the photographs, she notices William actively participating in the aftermath, and to her astonishment, young Peter is also present at the scene. Later that day, Peter returns to the railroad tracks, struggling to remember the events of that fateful night. He recalls running through the woods and witnessing someone manipulating the controls in the signal box. As this memory resurfaces, Peter approaches the signal box near the tracks. Inside, he ascends the stairs and stands before the door, which suddenly swings open, revealing Barry's lifeless body hanging from the ceiling. When the police arrive at the scene, Peter has no choice but to confess to Barbara that Barry had also left his bike on the tracks. Simultaneously, Barbara arrives at William's house and asks him if she can speak with him. William welcomes her inside. Barbara expresses her doubts about the train crash incident, particularly Peter's account of two bikes mistakenly left on the tracks. She confronts William with his own report, where he stated that he received a call at the police station and took the Oakstone Road to reach the scene. Barbara points out that the wreckage completely blocked that road, making it impossible for him to access it unless he was already there before the accident. She presents the badge found in the signal box, which she believes belonged to the missing schoolgirl, Elizabeth Valentine. William had closed Elizabeth's case after discovering her body in the wreckage. However, her cause of death remained inconclusive, and Barbara suspects that Peter witnessed something that night. Back at the signal box, Peter finally recollects the events of that fateful night. He saw a girl running from a car. In the flashback, young Peter investigates the signal box upon hearing a scream. To his horror, he witnesses Elizabeth being attacked from behind by his father, William. Elizabeth pulls a lever, causing the train to derail. Following the derailment, William murders Elizabeth and conceals her body in the wreckage. Young Peter witnesses the entire gruesome scene. Back at William's house, Barbara decides to wait for Peter while William offers her a cup of tea. Sensing a possible threat, Barbara reaches for her gun just in case, but William strikes her on the head. He then places her in the trunk of her own car, drives it into his garage, and locks her inside. Shortly after, Peter arrives and discovers his father in the garage. Peter confronts William, revealing that he remembers everything. When Peter questions his father about his actions and how many other girls he has killed, William pulls out a gun and orders Peter into the garage. Peter complies, and during their tense exchange, he questions how his father can live with the guilt for all these years. In a moment of distraction, Peter seizes the opportunity to engage in a physical altercation. Unfortunately, William manages to grab a tool from the floor and strikes Peter with it, rendering his son unconscious. Before dawn the following morning, William drives across town with Barbara in the trunk and Peter unconscious in the back seat. Unexpectedly, William encounters Elizabeth standing in the middle of the road, losing control of the steering. The car veers off the road, causing Peter to fall out while still unconscious. The vehicle ends up on the railway tracks. As William attempts to restart the car, all the doors lock on their own. Desperate to escape, he struggles to open them, but to no avail. In the rearview mirror, he is horrified to see a monstrous-looking Elizabeth. The distant sound of a train horn fills the air. In the nick of time, Peter regains consciousness and spots the approaching train. He seizes his father's gun and frantically shoots at the car's windows until he successfully breaks open the trunk, allowing Barbara to escape. However, as William tries to exit, Elizabeth reappears and pulls him back in. Peter witnesses the apparitions of the accident victims before they slowly fade away. As Peter prepares to leave, he sees Elizabeth Valentine one final time, appearing serene as she walks away. Days later, we find Peter sitting at the beach with Evie. She gives him a tender peck on the forehead before walking into the ocean, finally finding peace and moving on.